Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Peter Llewellyn, and I run the services at MedCommsNetworking.com. So information services, resources, activities, and so on for people who work across the global MedComms community, by which I'm talking people who work in and around medical communications, medical education, medical publishing, and the associated businesses. We also do provide a lot of information for people who are interested in the business. You might want to be a writer or an editor, account manager, or whatever, or just want to know more about the business. You'll find over at First MedComms job lots of useful insights into the business and how to get a job. Over at NetworkPharma TV, importantly, we've now got more than 500 videos on all manner of topics around and about MedComms. So there's lots of things to go and have a look at if you've not seen them already. Today, I'm absolutely delighted. These webinars are great because we can bring different people together from different parts of the world and talk about topics. And I think today we're probably talking about something that isn't talked about very often. So very pleased that we're talking about translation in MedComms. Without further ado, I'm just going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves, and we're just going to have a 40-minute or so panel discussion. Members of the audience, please use the text boxes to fire off your questions, observations, and your own experiences. With no further ado, I'm going to ask Carrie, though, to lead off and tell us about herself. Where are you, Carrie, and what do you do?
Thank you, Peter. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Carrie Brubaker, and I'm an independent consultant in medical affairs and communication strategy based in Munich, Germany. I consult to medical affairs and medical communications teams in the industry, as well as to stakeholders like service providers and patient advocacy. These days, whether we're working on digital innovation, educational materials, engagement strategy, launch excellence, translation plays a role in my clients' work streams. I firmly believe that better prioritization of translation of MedComms content supports medical affairs and medical communications excellence, and thereby improves patient outcomes. There is a role for translation across the therapeutic product development lifecycle, and I'm really looking forward to discussing these opportunities today, together with Peter and my co-panelists, Amanda Ryan and Helen Williams. With that, I'll turn the introductions over to Amanda. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carrie. I always love hearing you talk about your passion for translation in your work. Hi, everyone. My name is Amanda Ryan. I am the president of G3 Life Sciences. We provide language and localization services across the research, drug development, post-market cycle. I have been in the localization space for over 15 years now, always kind of living in the space of life sciences and really building a passion for the health access and equity and inclusivity side of what language brings, from the content creation phase through getting content out to anybody and everyone, regardless of where you live, what language you speak, and from that perspective. So I'm very excited today to have this conversation and hear questions from you all. I'll hand it over to Helen.
Thank you, Amanda and Carrie. It's great to be here today. I'm Dr. Helen Williams. I come from an academic background in modern languages. I've been in life sciences for around 13 years now, leading language service teams at Oxford Outcomes, where I learned my subject matter expertise in linguistic validation of clinical outcome assessments and ECOA program delivery. I then have worked in real-world evidence as well at a startup, which turned into a scale-up over the last 5 years, where I got to work with product teams and patients advocates and really see the benefit of working with those stakeholders when you're developing content, not only the translation content, but the source content of digital environments. This year, I've taken the plunge and founded my own language consultancy, which is called The Word Desk. So thank you for having me.
Excellent. Okay, so guys, we're just winging this a little bit. This is just a panel discussion that we're having today. Very keen to involve any questions from the audience, and we've got another good international audience there. So please do ping us your questions, guys. I'm going to just start with Carrie and put you on the spot slightly. I mean, to be frank, and we can be open about it. You came to me and suggested this. This is a topic that's not being talked about very much, Peter. I mean, I've said in part of my messaging about the event, I can't be the only person that worked on a project, got to the stage where we presented it to the global HQ. It's all done in English. Everyone's very happy. And then someone in the room puts their hand up and goes, but what about country X or country Y or whatever? Why is it always it's the last thing that's thought about? Just run with it, Carrie. Just set the scene a little bit. What's the frustration? Why does it work out like that? And then we'll bounce that around the group and see what the different opinions are.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I think at the highest possible level, we fall victim to inherent bias, and a lot more has come out in professional expertise and work environment engineering about inherent bias over the last 5, 10, 15 years. And indeed, one of these is geographic bias. We as human beings tend to think about the people or the environments that are closest to us. And if we are not seeing those people or engaging with those environments on a regular basis, whether in person or even remotely, psychologically, intellectually, they tend to fall off our radar. And then we fall prey to the same issues that pharma and medtech industries face, which is there are project deadlines, things pop up, people get stressed out, projects get rerouted, programs get reorganized. Things fall into a hierarchy of needs. And to your point, too often we see the translation requirements come too late. One of the things that we're trying to do here today is encourage everyone in the audience and everyone who's listening afterwards to the recordings to think about moving the priority for translation further in your development cycle. I know that both Amanda and Helen can speak to this, and I'm happy to hear what they have to say as well.
Okay, so pick it up and run with it. I mean, I'm going to bounce around a little bit here. We're going to bounce around a little bit here, so that keeps everyone on their toes. So, but go on, Amanda. You started to say something, and I cut across you. Run with this one.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely hit the nail on the head there. And it is interesting because what we're seeing, particularly in a post-pandemic world, is we're seeing more regulatory bodies looking at ways to create more inclusive access to information at various points and, tweaking their recommendations or possibly regulations. But really what it is a mentality shift of those that are in, all these various stages and really looking at what is the end goal of this information and what are they trying to achieve. And if it's really about the audience, about the patients, about the education piece of it, having to think a little bit bigger. And as you mentioned earlier on, and it's interesting because, when you're working in any phase of development or research or whatever the case may be, you have so many different partners, so many different people involved, and so many of those you bring in at the very beginning. You might be kicking off a brand new study or creating an omnichannel approach to getting information out there. You've got people at the table day one that are contributing to what that strategy is. Yet rarely do we see language services at that table. But in the reality is that's where it needs to be, because it's not just about, what the timeline for translating this English content into Spanish, how many days are you going to need? It's also about what is the content? Is the content culturally appropriate for Spain? Is the channel that you're using the most effective way to get the information to that audience? There's a lot more to really look at there, in addition to how do you get it from one language to another. And so being part of the strategy early on will not only, honestly, save time, save money, save a lot of aspects to it, but really help you make a strategy that is truly going to reach the people that you are trying to reach versus put it out there and, hope for the best.
I get that, and I think we're all going to agree on this one. But I also am very aware of the practicalities. And just picking up on your points there, Amanda. I mean, of course, we should all be around the same table at the beginning, because we should always be around the same table at the beginning of everything, sort of thing. But in reality, it can be very difficult content. And you can understand whether, I don't know, the global corporate team works on a project in order to present it to companies and so on around the world. And there's a complete chicken and egg sort of problem in there, isn't there?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I guess we're just going to agree that there's a practical problem, even if we're trying for the ideal sort of thing. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that this is a journey, and we're seeing again more progress, I think, in the last 2 years. I'd love to hear what Helen thinks from her experience and perspective, but you're starting to see a shift. You're starting to see a shift in the way language is looked at as a piece of the puzzle. And, again, if that shift away from it would be nice to have to actually without it, I'm not achieving the goals and what I set out to be. So just starting that shift to think about it at different points. It's a step in the direction of, being at the table with your agencies, in that initial kickoff.
Okay. Helen, as I understand it, you focus very much more on the patients. I mean, I'm quite keen that this conversation covers, there is a problem with healthcare professionals that we can often forget about because it's assumed they all read English sort of thing. But you, as I understand it, focus more on patients and so on. But talk about this issue of getting in early enough from your point of view.
It's true. Yes, I agree with what both Carrie and Amanda have just been outlining. And the being at the table at the beginning is a really critical part. It's something I've seen both sides of. So I've been in a very large language service provider where we were given the materials when it's sort of ready for rollout, and you get a couple of months maximum, and you've got to cram quite a lot of multiple stakeholder management and complexities when it comes to patient-reported outcome measures. You're dealing with academic institutions or bodies who have produced those instruments, who have licensing and permission complexities. You have, the most extreme example I can think of in my project history was trying to get permission from a developer on a translation, a target version, and they were hunting polar bear. They were on a polar bear expedition for months. And we have a sponsor asking, where's the translation? And there's nothing you can do as the project manager. And there are other examples as well, because you're dealing with different, places all around the world. There's project days where you have somebody's fallen off a ladder in Greece, but there's rocket fire on the Gaza Strip, or there's a flood in India and you can't deliver. So you're given the materials really late in the game, and you have such a complex range of stakeholders to manage. And on the flip side of that, I've been in a real world evidence company where I was lucky enough to work on the source content with the product team, with the data scientists, with the patient-centered outcomes team. And in that situation, you can flag really early on, oh, that's going to be a problem translatability wise. You're going to have a problem with that if you're going to go into Russian or whatever language later on. And equally, the data scientists could say, the measurement that you're using there won't work for every territory. You're going to have to tweak that. So, thinking from a project management point of view of how are we going to review that source content early on? And how are we going to factor in all these stakeholders? It's a huge part of being able to deliver. And that, for the patient content that I'm used to working on, where it's a very robust methodology, you're looking at 2 months at least to kind of factor in the method that you're looking at. And to the extent that even translation technology providers have had to work with large CROs and other companies to figure out how to fit that workflow into the translation technology, because it can be 6 or 8 rounds of different linguists, different people reviewing the content. So it's incredibly complex, and it's definitely worth having language experts around the table before, a multi-country program, definitely.
Okay, come on. You can't blame me for picking up on this one. So polar bears. Obviously, there's a story there we'd love to know, but just out of interest from Amanda and Carrie, have you got? It's great fun to hear a few of the sort of like the war stories, as it were. What's something you can share that matches a polar bear experience?
I've got nothing that matches a polar bear expedition. That is outstanding. But before the webinar came online, we were chatting about conferences that are coming up, and this is an environment, particularly in local or regional settings, where there's an opportunity. Just as one example, there's an opportunity for materials in translation. And a good example of this is poster reprints. It may be that an organization has had a poster or an oral presentation approved at a major conference or a conference in an English-speaking locale, and then another team within the same organization and present it in their local language. Now, typically, there are pages and pages and pages of SOP that are associated with this. And sometimes the timelines just don't work out because the number of stakeholders that are involved in essentially those pages and pages of SOP might not be available for whatever reason. And if somebody is on holiday for 2 weeks or even a 3-day weekend and you're in a time crunch, there's literally nothing that you can do. And so my takeaway from that, particularly this is now going to be my metaphor, is the polar bear expedition, is it benefits all of us to become advocates for the work that we do. Start communicating with your stakeholders, start communicating with your team members, start communicating with your clients about reasonable expectations for timelines on these types of things, how to go about it in the right way. Amanda, what about you? Any polar bear expedition experiences?
I definitely don't think I can top either one of those, but I will. It might be my biggest takeaway from this conversation, the polar bears entering the chat for sure. But I can't, I mean, what you just said is so interesting because it makes me think of this panel that I did probably about a year ago now with some others here in the US. And there was a gentleman on the panel from a local IRB in America and talking about the complexity of those SOPs. So whether it's a regulation, whether it's just an SOP in a company. And one thing that, you know, with all the points that you mentioned, the biggest one being, if you're that person and you're like, wow, it would be great to have this in local language. And then you look up what you have to do in order to make that happen. And you have all these other things that you have to do as part of your job already. Your first thought's going to be, no, I can't do that. I can't, you know, I have to go to this person, that person, and follow this process. And so the complexities of being able to translate sometimes immediately override even that mentality of this is the right thing to do, this is a value added service. And the point that he was making, which was quite interesting from the IRB perspective for those types of, you know, regulatory documents that need approval, it's like, kind of toe the line. We have guidance, we have regulations, and we have guidance, but don't let that deter you from doing the right thing. You know, we want to see people at all different phases. It's about communications in general. It's about getting information that is necessary information in this space to the people that need it. And don't let the rules stop you from doing something that's above and beyond the baseline expectations. But I think we have a really long way to go. And you're right, Carrie, I think that it's that advocacy. It's advocacy from, you know, those who understand the language space. It's advocacy within organizations, for sure, from the doctors, from, you know, the medical professionals, from the patients, even to making people want to do a little bit more and not let them get deterred in that sense. And I think that that's just really important. It's just a constant holdup, but we're hearing more of that advocacy, especially people like Carrie starting to speak out, and not just Helen and I who live in the industry and kind of have lived and breathed localization for our careers. That's what we need to be seeing more of.
Can I just pull it back a little bit as someone who doesn't understand the translation business, if you like, and there'll be people watching this who don't. Can I just pick up on what Helen was talking about, translation technology? And it was, you know, that sounded quite, that was quite an interesting. You just sort of mentioned it, and it's like I can imagine there's quite a lot involved in that. Can you just talk me through and treat me as the idiot, as it were? But there'll be other people watching this who won't understand this. What do you mean by that? And talk a bit more about the process that we need to understand in order to involve you properly. Is that making sense?
Okay, it's quite a big topic, but I think, and Amanda, jump in and you know, tell me if you think anything different. So you have, you know, a whole world of translators out there, and they will be using CAT tools, computer assisted technology, translation tools, to produce their work. And equally, the language service providers will have translation technology. Some example, like a very familiar example to most people would be Trados, but there's things like MemoQ, there's things like WordBee, other solutions out there on the market too. And what they do is they are a translation program management tool. So they vary, but largely you can work with your linguists via the platform. So you can send out jobs, you can work on the source file. So very basic terms, you can take a source document and you can take out the repetitions just while you're doing some of the translation stages. So you take them slightly out of context, but the software will know what you're doing with it. And it means that if you've got something like a patient-reported outcomes instrument that has 10 STEM questions with equal response options, that should remain consistent throughout the document, that the translator can translate them once, and then the tool at the end will populate the other 9 occurrences with the exact translation, which will then have another quality assurance step by a human. So you effectively are working efficiently, consistently, and it costs less because you're stripping out the need for a translator to do repeat work. If it's a very large document, you can imagine how that would multiply out. So that's the kind of basic introduction, but you can pull a source file in, it hides the formatting, you get the pure text you want to translate, and then you can get the formatted document out at the end. So working with humans all the way through, you can end up with a target document that is perfectly mapped to your source, and you're just mitigating the risk of it being a manual process. On top of that, it could also have features like asset management. So you can build glossaries and term bases as you go. You can export those as a language service provider to your client. They can give it to other language service providers. They can pull it into their own software. And it means that if somebody has a diabetes study, they can develop a diabetes glossary that will last them for years, and they can keep their terminology consistent across languages. So that's what we use. Typically, it might be steps like translate, edit, proof, but for something like linguistic validation, you're looking at dual forward translation, a reconciliation, a single or double back translation step, then cognitive interviews and review, then maybe a double proofread as well. So it's multi-step support for your translation. And that's different, I ought to say as well, from the machine AI software.
Right, okay. So
yeah.
I would like to go into that. I was on the top. But before we go into that, maybe, has Amanda got anything she'd like to add to that from that sort of process point of view? And we're obviously a long way. I mean, it was a long time since I've done this sort of thing, but in the good old days, we'd hand it over to someone who spoke and wrote in the language, and they did it sort of thing. I mean, I recognise we're a long way from there, but that's all sounding very sophisticated. But just talk to us a little bit about that, Amanda, from your point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Helen really nailed it. It's interesting because, and I saw that there was a comment about how we're seeing a lot more internal translation teams being built up within organization from some of the earlier stuff. But I think technology is really where we take it back in that critical aspect of having the experts. And there's a lot of value to having internal translation teams. There's a lot of value to partnerships between industry experts in those teams, but technology moves at the speed of light. We all know it. And I actually think in the language industry, the CAT tools and everything Helen just explained have been around for quite some time. And they've really, in the last 15, 20 years, they've developed immensely in terms of capabilities. But these last 5-10 years, and I would say the last year alone, the push into machine learning and AI and the shift in what that's brought into the industry has just been astronomical. And there's a ton of value to it in conjunction with the tools that Helen were talking about, translation, having a TMS that can help organize the project management of all of this. And now we're talking about things like neural machine translation, which is, some of your baseline for, say, your Google Translate or your Amazon, these web-based or these AI-based translation tools, but it's so much more than that. They're trainable, they're customizable. The importance of bringing in the language expert to taking that artificial intelligence and maximizing its capacity as kind of, as Helen said, a QA tool is changing the industry in terms of cost, time. We know that time is the issue here, and having that ability to turn things around, but also quality when done correctly. And when, you're working with the experts who truly understand how to maximize it, not just throwing it in Google Translate, which I don't recommend doing for about a million reasons, biggest of which being security. Right. We're working with things here that obviously that is of the most critical importance is the security of the data. But to be able to continuously train and customize and pair that with the expertise of a human is going to allow us to be that much more impactful. And now we have generative AI, Chat GPT. It's been the biggest thing all over the internet for the last, I would say, 3 to 6 months. There's so much research and development going on in how to use generative AI. And I think the answers are still to be determined. There are still so many opportunities out there in how to maximize these tools. But the most important part of it, and I super strongly believe this, is that language is never going to be a fully technology commodity. And you have, especially in the pharma space, you see people who are very risk friendly and jumping head into tech, and in some cases trying to replace humans with artificial intelligence. And then you see on the other side those who are willing to maybe dabble or really shy away from talking about it at all, and want their 3-step human process, and are fearful of introducing more technology into the process. But the reality is, it's here, it's happening. There's a ton of value to it. I have been working with machine translation with CROs and pharma companies now for at least 8 years. I think I was on the earlier side of some of the work that we started doing, but that human component is always going to be necessary. The expertise that comes from a language expert who knows the industry, who knows the language, I can't imagine a time where that is not going to be a really critical part of this process. So it's really on us to continue to drive the conversation and bring the two together, within the industry, to figure out how is this going to help us do more for more people? How is this going to help us bring information out to more people in the right way, in a way that mitigates risk but embraces the technology that's just happening around us.
Can I just, before we lose it, because I was interested in everyone's views on the sort of the AI journey, let's call it that. Before we lose it, a question came in a while ago, and I think it was on the back of what Helen was talking about, these sort of CAT processes. And the question, which I've now lost, but it's in there somewhere, is along the lines of, are there limitations to what you can put into those CAT systems in terms of the content of documents? Someone's answered it by saying the CAT systems, I might be oversimplifying this, tend to be, they're offline, they're on someone's computer, you haven't got data protection issues there. But can you just, again, for someone like me, not fully understanding this, can you just cover that off? And then maybe let's start looking at some of the new opportunities with so-called AI. But with the CAT systems you were talking about, Helen, can you just cover that off? Is it as simple as, well, isn't, it's just on a computer, it's like anything else,
two things
it's
come
protected.
to mind. There's nothing really massively problematic. The two things that do come to mind are dead files, so dead PDFs, no one can ever do anything with. So if you've got something for translation, your translation provider is going to have to do some work to kind of, I'm sure even since my time dealing with the last dead file I dealt with, there's probably something online now where you can put it in and it extracts it. But you have to get the content out into a live file type for it to be workable. And then also there used to be some cases where certain languages weren't supported as a target language. Amanda, is that the case still? The more difficult character languages it tended to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I like everything else with technology, it's developing. I think a good example of that would be even like Hebrew or Arabic being left to right languages. Challenges absolutely with that in CAT tools. I have worked mostly with WordFast in my career, which has been really interesting to see the development of that tool in the languages that it supports. There are a lot more cloud-based tools as well for that information sharing, to the point of data protection. Data protection has been a huge driver. It has to be a huge driver in all the technologies that we're using, because we're, especially in the space we're talking about now, you've got to really mitigate that risk of access. So there are a lot more ways to be able to leverage and also restrict. For example, there are definitely some CAT tools and some processes where a translator may not be able to actually save it locally, or they will have to work off some type of a cloud setup in order to mitigate that part. But there are so many tools out there, just like any other, just like a phone, for example. You have a variety of different possible phones you have. There are that many different CAT tools in the industry, which is great because they're constantly developing and developing new opportunities and new ways to utilize it, and kind of competing with each other to improve it. And it's not going anywhere with machine translation. I think to that point, it is a really powerful tool to aid the human translation process. If you couple the CAT tool with machine translation together, that is really where the opportunities come in, integrating the two, maximizing the machine translation where there isn't already translation memory, leveraging those repeat messages or previously translated, terms or sentences or segments. That's really where we're starting to see maximizing all the different technologies out there and making sure that you have that human that is ultimately being that QA step on all of that content.
Okay, that was interesting. Carrie, I'm going to bring you in and let's go back to like this whole AI future, as it were. Just from your perspective, where are we at? Where are we going?
Yeah. So I know that in the context of these webinars, Peter, you've been having a lot of conversations about generative AI. You've been having a lot of conversations about ChatGPT, prompt engineering, and so on. And part of the passion in the work that I do is, and people who are American will perhaps remember this term, I like to call it no professional left behind. We used to have an educational policy in the US called no child left behind, but I like to think of it as no professional left behind. And what I'm seeing in the work that I do is that there's starting to be a separation among groups, among professional populations, to Amanda's point, people who are absolutely at the cutting, bleeding edge of wanting to be involved in awareness and understanding and training and participation and expertise in these technologies, all the way over to very technology averse, very change averse. I will leave aside the psychological assessment for either of those categories and everything in between. But the point that I am slowly trying to make here is that translation, along with many other facets of the pharmaceutical and medtech industries, is evolving. The skill sets that professionals will require are evolving. And what I want to see is a greater population of professionals having the knowledge set, having the skill sets, having access to training and development and understanding in order to be able to do their jobs better and in order to be able to continue working successfully as these things evolve. A classic quote floating around the internet these days is, AI is not going to take your job, but people who understand AI are probably going to take your job. And that's not meant to be provocative or insulting in any way. It's really meant to be food for thought. And I see exactly kind of these behaviors in the context of translation also playing out in other professional areas in the work that I do.
Can I ask a stupid question? I always ask stupid questions, so why can't I ask a stupid question? The sorts of things you're talking about, I don't know. I mean, if someone's listening to this and they're interested in this, what are the associations? What are the sort of environments in which forums that people can join to meet up with people like you and talk about this sort of stuff? I literally don't know what I'm asking here. You know, would you be able to give people a couple of examples of the association of this or the group of that where we're talking about this sort of stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, to the point I made, your webinars are a good start for people who want to be involved in a bit more passive learning. There are actually good resources and good conversations happening on LinkedIn every day. Get yourself connected to the thought leaders or start following thought leaders on LinkedIn. There are also good articles that have been coming out recently out of places like Harvard Business Review, for example. And the nice thing about a lot of these generative AI technologies is you can go and dabble in them yourself. They are free of charge. I'm not saying that people should be doing this in connection to the work that you're doing, because we can have that conversation about data protection and patient information protection. But a great place to start is there's an AI for that, which is amassing a library of AI technologies, everything from soup to nuts. And you can look at generative AI technologies that are going to help build slide decks, help write speeches, help create images, help organize your email inbox. And there's an aspect of this that is self-learning and self-driven, but the resources are definitely out there.
But specifically, I mean, I know like MWEL, the European Medical Rights Association, has a strong translation community sort of thing. I mean, which I guess would be a starting point to find people who are involved in translation business. But are there other international groups that you would go at the general level? These are the sorts of people that are talking about these sorts of issues.
Yeah, another group that I can think of is the ISMAP in the United States. So the Medical Writers, the Publication Professionals Society in the United States is another good example, which is analogous to the one that you've just mentioned for the United States. But the conversations are not limited to what's going on in the United States. You'll find good insights in the work that they do that can be relevant to your particular geographic location or your professional environment.
Okay, Amanda or Helen, have you got any suggestions just on that simple point that we can point some people?
Given my area, which is more outcomes research, ISPOR and ISAQOL have special interest groups on translation and cultural adaptation and digital health, which also covers some translation. For translation industry updates, I look at Slater and NIMDZI, NIMDZI. And I've been looking recently at the Patient Information Forum and their work with the Association of Translation Companies. They have this PIF-TIC set of recommendations for companies working on content that's destined for patients and how to translate that properly. So that's really interesting stuff. And I was going to say, Ana Sofia Correa, who's in our audience today, her website is incredible. It's such a good resource from the translator, medical writer perspective of all the different things that are happening in the industry with technology and methods.
Okay, that's something to look out for. Amanda, have you got anything to add in there? We just had someone put in the chat that there's the American Translators Association. Yeah. Although I guess that's the point being there's a subgroup for medical translators. Anything else to add in? I just like giving people signposts if we can. Amanda, do you have anything to add?
I think I know we have quite a few translators on the call and you're probably all familiar with this, but ProZ is a really interesting website that has a lot of training and a lot of insight from the linguist and the language perspective. And I know that they have an increasing amount of AI. So it's a really good place to just kind of understand industry-wide for those who are in the language profession. Interestingly, there's I think too, just following some of the larger, I mean, it's coming from a smaller translation group, but some of the larger players in the localization industry are, increasingly getting more and more into the thought leadership side and where those two converge. There was an interesting summit that was launched in the past year or two called the C3 Summit, Conversations on Clinical Content, in partnership with those in the pharma industry and the organization TransPerfect, which my company has some connections with. So that's been a really interesting thought leadership that's bridging the two together and talking about the future of translation in that space. But yeah, I think all the other, every other resource that was mentioned is something that I'm certainly familiar with.
It's just nice. It's nice that we can push people in those, and people can connect with you and ask more and so on. I wanted to get back to some practicalities. Just looking at those questions, but get back to some practicalities. And I quite liked a question that came in. It's the sort of thing, I must admit, I feel like my impression is I had a problem with this years and years and years ago, but I can understand the problem. You've sort of written it, you've designed the thing, you've done it in English, whatever it is, and then they want it translated into Italian or something. And the word count's completely different. The design's all messed up. I'm stating the obvious, but tips, tricks, are you just going to say, well, you think about it at the beginning, or have you got any sort of advice for people who are trying to think about it ahead of themselves? Because that's just a very practical problem, isn't it?
You can look up expansion rates. So off the top of my head, I think it's 1.25 from English to Spanish or Italian or French, for example.
Is it? Okay, right. Yeah.
Okay. If you're working on screens and devices, you're always going to get text being cut off or not, having to scroll quite far down if you're going into those Romance languages, really. Amanda, anything else? Character languages are always tricky, like you said, right to left, accommodating that sort of thing is really, tough.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that expansion piece, and that goes back to almost the different, the kind of omnichannel approach to communication too. I mean, it's no longer just a Word document or an InDesign file for graphic design. It's apps, it's websites, it's virtual and real life posters, all these things. So taking into account the fact that every language is not going to be the same, like, again, the sizing, the right to left, the shrinking or the expansion of it, and then taking it a step further too in terms of the appropriateness of the content, and what a translation even means, what your goal is of that outcome. Is it a word for word translation? I mean, when if we're talking very very medical or biochemical or really factual based technical text, that is one thing to be very true to the source. But then if we're talking, again, something that's meant to be more engaging, something that is intentionally designed in English in a specific way to target a specific group of people, maybe a younger audience or whatever the case may be, you've got to take these things into account when you're bringing it into another language, because you're also bringing it into another culture, another target group of people. So there are all these things to take into consideration with how that language is going to look on the back end. That again, I think the translators on the call, I'm sure, are able to relate to more than anyone. But those who need it the most maybe don't understand that, particularly if they only speak one language, which is something I'm actually only an English speaker myself. I always found it quite interesting that I ended up in this industry. I did attempt to learn Italian at university. It did not resonate very well with me, but I have a very interesting vantage point surrounding myself with all of these incredibly brilliant multilingual professionals that I will never fully understand and can relate to it as somebody who doesn't have that. But I understand why others in my position don't get it. And they don't necessarily know these things until it's too late or at all, and generally the way that they learn is by something going wrong and being on the back end of having to navigate that and then thinking, oh, next time I don't want to be in this position where turned out what I asked for or the way that I approached it didn't get me what I need, and I don't understand why it didn't, but it didn't.
And I think this is where sorry, Peter, if I may, 1 minute. I think this is, again, where we, for better or for worse, return to the advocacy angle. And I firmly believe that the very question you asked, Peter, is what is it that we're trying to achieve here is a key component of that conversation. And from where I sit, what we're trying to achieve here is to improve patient and healthcare system outcomes. And we can always take it back to the argument, and there are case studies online from countries around the world about how when materials are made available in a local language, in a second or third or fourth language of that locale, that health outcomes are better. Hospitals see this, organizations see this, nurses see this. The data are there. And if we want to be kind of ugly and relate it back to profit or budget or who's going to pay for it, the point is that better patient outcomes raises the boats for everyone. And the advocacy will need to take place where communicating the value of other languages, particularly to people who are sole English speakers or are the sole English speakers who are the budget holders, that's going to be a key component. Whether you're preparing a new patient website, whether you're preparing new sales aids, whether you're considering making your chatbot available in Spanish as well as English, whether you want to prepare multilingual materials for your upcoming Congress. I will not give 25 more examples, but I'm sure everyone in the audience has seen these examples, seen how they can go right, but also seen how they can go wrong.
Okay. We're probably over time slightly, so probably that's probably not a good note to end on. I suppose my only thinking was, I don't want to open this one up too much, but it's there's a lot of talk about inclusivity. What am I trying to say? Translation isn't, I think you talked about it, Amanda, it's not just as simple as taking one word and translating it to another word. I mean, the inclusivity of language should start at the beginning, but the problem as you translate and go through the system is that inclusivity of language is something that's really important to hang on to, and you can't do that if you just translate the words, sort of thing. And I guess that's why the human beings were so important and all the rest of it, but the whole QC side of things, and you've touched on this a lot, is clearly complicated and time consuming. And it just comes back to the basic point where I guess we all started with. you have to think about this early on and build it into the plan. You can't just sit there at the end and go, and just translate that into German, Peter, sort of thing. It just doesn't work like that. Maybe again, we're all nodding, and I can't. We let's just draw a line there, because I think I get a sense we could talk more. But in terms of the recording, I'm going to say a huge thank you to you. I think that was really interesting to listen to you guys talking. I hope it's given lots of people real, food for thought. I know I can speak for you and say, anybody watching this, please, contact the panelists via LinkedIn is an easy way of doing so. Okay, so hopefully people will reach out to each other. Hopefully we are at least helping the conversation, Carrie, and getting it out there and getting people talking to each other. As I know you're very happy to hear from people and so on. So very, very interesting, and maybe we can follow this up in the future. But just for today, I'd like to say a huge thank you. I'm going to stop the recording with a little wave and tell people, come and look at medcommsnetworking.com for what I'm doing, but basically and importantly, talk to you guys about this important issue. So thank you very much. Quick wave. Bye-bye.